Let's do a let's play, but for writing poems, with your host, me, Sam J. Richings. Step 1, the first draft or the free write. So this is just where you take either your scribbled notes from your messy notebook, which you carry around in your back pocket so everyone at the coffee shops knows that you are queer and available, and you type it up. If you are like me and use your phone notes instead, then just copy and paste onto a Google Drive. I'm trying to stop using Google Drive, but um, I don't know that it wants to steal my ideas. I've tried to catch them out for plagiarism, but as yet, I've yet to find anything. Anyway, this is a first step. So this is after a free write, after you've generated the idea and put it into paper. That's what we want to be doing at this point. So it should look like this. Step 2, thinking. The next process after moving the draft, the free write from either your notebook or your phone notes onto a word processor is to leave it. I don't think there's any strict rule that cannot be disregarded or not followed. And certainly I don't want to ever be didactic about anything like this. So if this doesn't work for you, you can work on it straight away. One of the reasons I say leave it is because what you initially write, what you initially compile, magpie together, however your process for a free write works, will have an idea in your head, a thread that you want to follow that you think is a great starting point for a poem. What I find is that with the way that you, as an individual, will use language and how that will kind of shape everything, actually the idea that you initially have may, spread forth these great ideas, but that initial idea is not the one that you want to follow through. And if you start with that idea and then just edit straight away, what is going to happen is you're going to edit into that idea. You're starting off with this idea and you're laser focused, and by not broadening horizons, you limit the possibilities of what the work can be. Now, this isn't to say that's a bad way to work. Oftentimes, if you're writing to commission, or if you have a real idea in your head for how you want the poem to be, you can edit straight away if you want. I still recommend giving it some breathing space anyway, just as a kind of a good idea, and you have that thought in your mind to go ahead and go, this is where I'm going with this, this is what it's going to be. I'll leave it for a day and then come back to it. That's fine. For me, I like to leave it, oftentimes a little bit more. Sometimes I mix up this in the next stage where I'm neatening up and kind of giving a presentable variation of the very first draft. But either way, you want to leave it, you want to have a think about it, have it in the back of your mind, or actively think about it, go off and consider something, re-watch, re-listen to whatever art it was that inspired that piece, review the conversations in your head that you had that kind of got you thinking along this trail, trying to search that initial moment of inspiration, and examine it from a different perspective at a different time, in a different mindset, just to better irrigate the soil with which you can see what grows. You've planted a seed. You don't know what it is. It could be fucking anything, and that's cool. That's really great. The way to find out what it is to go, oh, if I water it with this, what will happen? If I water it with this, what will happen? If I put it in this kind of soil? All these kind of questions. So letting something fester and kind of bloom in this glorious rot of what could be. It also removes yourself from the initial idea, which is a really good way of doing it, especially because I find that for me, the initial draft says this is the idea that you had when you wrote this, and it's intrinsically there in the poem, and you can always come back to it. And what you can do is you can write away from that, and you can write as far away as you want to go. After you've taken a day, a week, a month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever, it could be a year before coming back to it and reviewing it. Your idea could be so far removed from the initial idea that when you then go, okay, well, I'll write into that, and you go off on a completely different tangent, do a couple of edits, follow the next few steps, and then later when you come back to it and you look at it again, you go, oh, but that initial idea is something that I want to write into. And by doing that, you kind of go, I've started here, I've gone over here, but I want to come back to here by the end, and you've created already this interesting narrative where the logical leaps are organic, or the illogical leaps are organic as well. So leave it as the next step, an important one. So I've called this the neatening, and as you can see, I am just largely making it presentable, amending any spelling errors and things like this. But actually, this has come after thinking about this and where I want it to go. So I know this isn't how I want the poem to be. You'll notice that I'm actually going to cut a big fuck off bit from it, um, after neatening it up a little bit. This whole piece, it's relevant to the thought process initially, but actually the idea that it's generated has made me go, I want to go somewhere different with this. So I like it. There's some banger lines in there. Banger lines we can put in a donor document that we can come back to, and delete it. But one of the reasons why I write in this method by keeping the old draft and everything like this is pretty much so that I can just go, I'm deleting this, and then I can see the variations between one and the next. And this bit is also generative. This is some other thought process that I had that I'm splicing into it. Um, One of the things I recommend is working on multiple poems at once. This is especially helpful if you're writing a collection because it can help you identify themes and what you want to talk about. But it also means that your poems can inform each other and influence each other, which I think is kind of really important. You want to make this mulch of work, and have your obsessions over the time of writing kind of influence it. I'm writing very much about cinema at the moment, so this is what I kind of thought, while keeping those key elements at the beginning end, or at least what I see as the key elements. I might have cut your favorite bit. That's fine. Step 4, editing, but also waiting. So just kind of finessing it here, copy and paste the previous draft into the page above, and amend it some. So I've justified the text, made it a bit tighter, and I'm just putting spaces in to have interesting words at the end of the line. Most people say that prose doesn't have line breaks. I disagree. I don't, but this is how you can make it seem like it does. One of the things I recommend when writing is to become an expert. Be really exceptionally curious, and I recommend Wikipedia, and finding something. So I originally thought of like having a rubber ring around you, and I said, actually, what are some other names? And that's where I came up with this name, which I'd never heard of before, but it's a more specific, more concrete example. And it was another image that kind of popped into my head while I was living in this space of having all these ideas where I was going, okay, so there's a lighthouse, there's an ocean, there's a father figure, there's what else is there? As I said, writing about cinema, so the idea of being filmed, and the kind of juxtaposition between a rubber ring and something filming you, so it's saving you while filming you, I found quite interesting. And again, writing into that, this is still generative for me. This is often how I work, adding in additional stuff that it comes from the ideas that I've inserted in. You're adding in a kind of smorgasbord of ideas, and then when one idea comes in, you take it to its logical conclusion to include it in there, and just kind of see almost exactly what's going on. Where can you go with this idea? Again, this is letting the poem take you where it takes you. So the stuff you've already written becomes a prompt for your future self to then go further into it. This helps with building metaphor. This helps with building ideas, concepts, and everything like this. Just for the record, Google Docs does not have a very good autocorrect. Don't trust it. But sometimes it gets it right. So yeah. And yeah, so just kind of putting in some ideas, trying to make sure that I'm maintaining that central image, or the image that sparked the idea, while branching off as well. We'll work on making it cohesive later. Sometimes when you're at this kind of quite early stage, it seems like it's a bit all over the place, and it absolutely is. But what you then do is later on you can go back through it and thread through an understanding of narrative, and you can go, okay, I've leapt somehow into something completely different. Let me change this. Let me see how I can link it, or let me remove it. Yeah, so just adding in bits, and often this may be different for people, but for me certainly, I find I tend to overwrite in the first drafts, and that's fine. Step 5, more editing, but also waiting. As with the last one, I'm kind of just continuing to expand. You can see again, I've copied and pasted, added it to the document above. It just means I have all the previous ones, and I'm changing the parameters here, which when you justify the text with the space breaks, it gives you this interesting negative space. Now, if you just want a blocky prose poem, delete them, but often I find if you justify something, make interesting endpoints on the lines, and then change the margins, it actually creates interesting spaces, and then you can lean into that and explore what those spaces tell you. Do you want negative space in this? Do you want that? Again, adding more interesting weirdness here, kind of going off-piste a little bit and exploring some of the ideas I've introduced, adding all this stuff. I mentioned overwriting, and I think at this stage it's okay to, because same as a free write, same as generative writing, you create the interesting stuff. When you're going into specifics, you're almost hyper-focusing, you're obsessing on ideas, and expanding it. So it will start to be a very messy garden at this stage, where you're finding a lot of weird stuff that you get, and kind of culling some stuff that you don't think works. You're shaping it a bit more in a direction you want. For this video, these are just kind of done in sync, but I mentioned waiting, and I think waiting is really important between drafts. Anytime I make a significant change to a draft, I add in a new version. I just add it on top so that I can see, in case I get to a stage, which will often happen, where you go, oh, I fucked it. I have gone off-piste too much. I don't know where I am. I don't know where the voice is, who the voice is, what's going on. But yeah, overwriting at this stage is fine. Again, neaten it, make it nice and fancy looking. Remove the negative space, didn't want it, all good. So again, same principle. Once again, we are copying and pasting. We are putting it above the old version. I've made a significant change. I think I want to move forward with this, whether to tighten up to be, send out for submissions, whatever it is, or if I just want to change it. What this means is by the end of it, you'll have a document with the newest version right at the top, first page, and then the older versions going back chronologically. And this helps. Joelle Taylor speaks about this when she spoke about kind of writing herself into a corner. If you know where you went, what corner you took off the road, then you can go back and find the correct route. This obviously does increase storage space shitloads when you have 100 poems waiting and you're copying and pasting essentially duplicate docs. And you can, if you want, at the end of them, get rid of the old versions. I don't even tend to do this once poems are published. I kind of think there's value in keeping them so you can see your process like this. Is another thing that the poet Sean Hill says, which I don't embed in my practice as much as I want to, but I think it's a really good practice to get in the habit of if you're starting out. Embed good practice early, which is any time where you have to kill a line, like you see I just did there. It was a line that I particularly liked, killing it, getting rid of it, copy and paste it into a separate doc, call it a Frankenstein document, and you're just going to have all the lines, all the bangers, all the darlings that you had to kill. Yeah, so here, this is where I'm kind of moving into that and going, does this work? Does this support this? Is this necessary? Does this further the narrative? Does this make this more interesting? And at this edit, I'm cutting back. So I've kind of let my garden go wild. Some interesting plants have come up, and I'm going, you know what? This doesn't work. And some things now that retain from earlier drafts no longer make sense. The idea of the poem has moved on. So I know a lot of people watching this will be like, oh yeah, concise, and it's still a fucking 300-400 word poem, taking up a whole of an A5 page. But for me, this is a concise. Anyway, step 6. What is form? I kind of know what form is. I don't use it. I typically stick to free verse. However, I know people reading this will be like, please stop with the prose. It's just a big block of text. I find a block of text very aesthetically pleasing. Other people like white space. If you're going to work with a form, it's best to start from the ground up. You can edit back from a free verse poem into a form if it kind of almost naturally sits there. I don't recommend this because you're kind of missing a lot of the interesting stuff that happens with creating from form. Josie Alford has a great video on this. Anyway, so here I'm just kind of changing the block poem, but adding a few line breaks. My line breaks you may disagree with. Please feel free to let me know if you think I've line breaked it in a stupid way. You can end on a sentence, but you almost want a line break to indicate a fractured thought, a kind of pause for the reader. So sometimes, each individual line should be a whole idea in itself. And with that in mind, you can kind of go, okay, well, there's an idea. Stop. Even if the idea continues on to the next line, adding a break in there, you're making people think what could come next, even if only for a moment. Maybe they're not as quick readers as you, so actually that moment lasts longer, but it adds suspense and it adds rhythm. At this stage of the edit, I'm not thinking of it, but it is sometimes useful to think about how this sounds. Don't rely on line breaks for pauses for breath, unless that's what the poem needs. The line breakers for the reader, not the speaker. Anyway, so yeah, just kind of messing around with this. Don't like the blocky phrase, so I'm just blocky prose. So I'm just adding in some line breaks, seeing if I can create interesting dictions. I like indenting text, indenting speech. I don't think it's proper. I just like it sometimes, and it helps me kind of go, this is not just the speaker of the speaker, this is a speaker of the poem saying there is another speaker who is also here. He's in, everyone's in the poem. Look at them, all gathered together. Anyway, yeah, still at this stage, removing stuff, adding to that conciseness. If you can make an image more interesting, an idea more arresting, more immediate, and that's what you want to achieve, then do it. You can see the difference between where we started off and here. You should wait a lot. I know it sounds silly, but the longer you leave it between drafts and work on other stuff and have it fresh in your mind, the better it is for you and the poem, which is the important bit. But I'm not going to show you me waiting. So instead, I'm going to show you making this even more structured and adding more line breaks and adding the concept of verses in, so seeing if I can concrete those thoughts in singular ideas, removing and editing as and when, kind of giving up some previous line breaks that I particularly liked, if they then serve the verse better. And then you have these three or four disparate ideas that are all linked in, but they're changed by this movement across the page. And this is literally just from waiting. I've just gone, I don't like this as a prose poem anymore. I don't want this as just a quite visually uninteresting piece. I want it to spread across the page. See how that, this kind of helps you think about how it's going to impact the reader. So quite different. Amending the spaces, adding the double space. I'm a sucker for a 1.15. That's my jam. But I have to admit, sometimes a 1.5 does look a lot better, a lot more poetic. And yeah, that's given you a bit of an idea of how to go about that. Now I'm changing it again. Though not shown, there was waiting between this. I've taken the idea of verses and I've gone to, I don't know what they're called, prose verses, where it's kind of a little mixture of both. So I'm making a bit more of a prose poem, but it's separated into, I think they're called stanza graphs. However, I'm very glad that I moved on fast from this, because to me, it does read more like prose. However poetic the language is, when you add in a stanza graph, there is every argument to be made. There are scholars who can tell you why this is important. I am not one of those. I'm just a guy. That's my brother texting me. Anyway, so this is how it ended up. And then I waited again. Well, kind of edited there. But I waited after this. I left it for I think quite a long while after this. This was the first thing all took space over the span of about anywhere from 7 to 8 months. I will correct myself at the end of the video and say how long it really took between those drafts. But, this poem has been gestating for a while. Some versions, I think, at this point had been submitted. Because, if you don't have a kind of network of people to speak to, then often sending it out and getting rejected is a good way of getting feedback about one particular person's taste. Getting rejected is not an indication if you're a good or bad writer, unless you're getting rejected everywhere and they're saying, please stop contacting us, get better at writing. but generally speaking, it is often a matter of taste. I, I can't find a rhyme or reason. There are poems that get long-listed, short-listed, everything like this. And it's just a matter of the editor's taste, really. It doesn't matter on the prestigiousness of the magazine. Anyway, thesaurus.com. This is where you kind of look to change it. This is just a really useful tool. Everyone knows what a thesaurus is. You can have one in real life as well. Even though you think you're well read, well spoken, whatever it may be, you can always stand to find more interesting or more appropriately more apt words. In this one, it was initially inherit. Someone was letting me inherit it, but I kind of changed it to the imparting, so it becomes less formal, less legal, more as if it's an honour they're bestowing upon me, which I found was a more interesting idea to look into. You don't have to agree with this. Again, you might have said inherit keeps that distance, inherit keeps that estrangement that you're kind of talking about throughout this piece. And that may be true, but I liked it, so I used it. So we're kind of nearing the end of the process. This is, if not the final boss, this is where I'll leave it. It's often said that a poem is never completed, it's just abandoned. I definitely agree with that. So I've gone from the stanza graphs, which I never like. I don't know why I kind of ever put stuff into that. I have poems published that are in stanza graphs. I just don't like them. Anyway, I moved back into is it going to be a prose poem, editing it into that. And you can see I'm kind of merging the ideas a bit more fluidly. This is all editing. I could have gone a bit deeper into the actual, rather than just the actual physical process of what I was doing, explained where my rationale came from. But pause the screen at any time to kind of see how it's developed, see how it's changed. I'm more than happy to kind of put the version history up so you can review it. But yeah, just changing it and then going, cool, let's see if that works. Changing it back to a prose poem again. I love a prose poem, but you can see how it's developed, and it's the way it's talking has changed. What it's talking about has changed, and now we're moving into this final zone. So this was just me kind of getting back to my basics, what I understand, what I'm comfortable with, and then going, all right, cool. I don't want a prose poem. I don't want a stanza graph poem. Let's have a look at what we can do. And moving into these lines and finding ways that are interesting to me to develop this story, and also not even really killing your darlings. I'm not like, I think a lot of people would say delete the first like 3 or 4 lines. Just start from the ocean's trying to seduce me, because that's like an interesting, arresting opening line. But I kind of like that dull intonation of like someone who's really, really fed up. It's like the empty house was there again on the shores of my sleep. And you're like, what? Again? What empty house? What sleep? What? You have a sea in your dreams? And I think that was kind of a lot of the impetus for it. And you can remove it and keep that resigned sense of, fuck, not this again, if you want. But for me, that's an arresting enough opening line. Everyone kind of goes, have to have a banger of an opening line. Fine, maybe you're right. I don't know. Anyway, intercostal muscles, again, make sure that your logic makes sense. I talk about body horror a lot, and this is where I'm talking about physically opening my chest up and heaving on the muscles between them. But I want to be medically accurate. Most of the stuff that happens in my poems could never happen in real life, hopefully. But just in case it does, you want to make sure that no doctor's going to go, well, actually, because I had a gig once where I was talking about physics, and I had a physics reference, and I had to stop the gig and say, hey, does anyone know science well enough to confirm this? And luckily I got it right. But it's important because it can remove people from the poem at all, completely. And yeah, maybe you think, I don't know, Sam, talking about severe body horror where people are gutting themselves in order to avoid their father figures, that is or is not the ocean, who is or is not trying to seduce them, might be a little alienating in some respects and take them out of the poem anyway. And I guess you'd be right. But, this is the strangeness that poetry brings. Um, You'll also notice that, like, just as an aside, while this is a very extended bit, some of the themes, some the themes of this poem are pretty, if not grim. You're kind of like going, "What the fuck is the light at the end of the tunnel? Is it is it a flamethrower? No, the light at the end of the tunnel is the bottom, the projector at the bottom of the ocean. Come on, pay attention. Where have you been?" I Different people disagree. I think a first draft, I think a free write, really good to write when you're in your emotions, when you're properly feeling whatever the hell you have to feel. Do not let that take you through. And it comes back to the first thing I was saying. Like, when you do a free write, it's great, it's important, it's generative, it's creative, it's interesting, it's where you're going to get the raw and interesting ideas that you can come back to at the end. But as you go through the poem, you have to remove yourself from that. If you don't, you're beholden to a narrative that may well not be in service to the rest of the work. Um, so I'm being lighthearted about it because I'm so far removed from having spent so long editing this and fucking around with it that it doesn't kind of matter anymore as much. Finally, the last stage. This is where we go, right. Again, copy and paste. You know the drill. Keep that up and keep doing it. This is where I'm kind of going really into it, and I've managed to find a way that it loops back around. Um, I've found a way that the narrative, both in terms of the underlying metaphor and the overall story narrative, are trying to say, they loops back and tie back in. So I'm just making sure as I go through that everything is in service to that, everything is working towards that, and there's nothing superfluous. And there still will be. This is like the last to final draft, I think. Like, but this is where I'm going. Okay, let's get fucking real. Let's get serious. And this feeling will last as long until this particular draft gets rejected again. Such is the way. Um, but yeah, it's adapting it and changing it into something that I think kind of has that place. One thing you'll notice with longer poems is that the narrative has to draw people in. I like to use a deadening motion of repetition to kind of numb people to these horrible things. I think it's an interesting way of doing things because then the actual shock comes from when there's something intimate and delicate later on or throughout that stands out and has more of an impact. But one thing, there should be like three narrative structures running through your poems in my mind, and they are on a graph labeled real, not real, on the x-axis, and length of time on the y-axis. And you should always be going. It should always be going up and down. You want to be dipping into that reality, changing around what people expect. Are you sticking in the physical realm when you talk about sensations? Are you going into the metaphorical? Is the metaphorical representative of something real that's actually happening rather than something, an experience, a feeling, an emotion? Is it going, oh, you're talking about going to a cinema with all your dead friends, and opening up your body so the ocean who's been trying to fuck you can watch a film and Netflix and chill? And what that does is that creates this confusion, this idea where it's like, oh, what is real? What is the underlying metaphor that is the truth and allows plausible deniability? Um, and that helps when people come up to you and say, oh, I love your poem that was about this. And you're like, brother, no, I was not talking about my letterbox top four. But I'm glad you got it from that. Do you know what I mean? Like, different people get different things from poetry, and I very much believe that once I've put this out in the world, whatever anyone gets from it is absolutely right. It's their poem now. I just wrote it. I just helped throw it at them. We tap into this ether, this creative mana pool, some collective consciousness, some fungal network, whatever it may be. And the only thing that matters is how we tell the stories that we find through our experience. And you'll find this much more as a performer rather than a writer, probably. But it's not those two are one and the same, different things. It's just whichever whichever you level up in more. Some people are more leveled up in performing than they are in writing. Other people are fucking boss at both, and sucks to be anyone else. But you will often find, depending on how veiled your metaphors are, depending on how deep and intricate or obtuse and strange or weird and gory, and what and depending on your cultural touchstones, people get very different ideas from your work, and that's absolutely fine. If you feel comfortable having a discussion with them and go, oh, rather than say, that's weird that you got that. That's not what it's fucking about, you idiot. Because that can minimize someone and make them feel really small, where they just acknowledged they connected to your poem. Whereas actually, what you could do is go, yeah, that's really interesting. Could you tell me what you got from that? And you could identify what it is that connected to them, what it is that spoke to them, where their frame of reference for listening is, what frame of mind they're in. And same as writing stuff can tell you really interesting things about you. The other interesting thing is what it can tell you about other people and what it can tell you about your relations to other people. So yeah, let the poem speak on its own terms. It's one of the reasons why I don't I don't always kind of say, oh, this poem is about this when I perform, because this poem is about I'll have a link, I'll have a joke, I might make a flippant reference to some of the extended gore in said poem, or obviously a trigger warning, because you don't want to be a dickhead and assume that trigger warnings are for losers. No, they're not. People have genuine triggers, mental health triggers, and sometimes people just want a nice night of poetry. Okay, if your poetry, I've said this before, but if your poetry relies on the surprise of saying, ha, sexual assault was the punchline the entire time, then you're not a good poet, and you should really think about that. Your poem should be able to stand up and say, hey, by the way, this poem contains reference to, allusions to, metaphors of this. Anyway, yeah, let people find out. So you can see I'm adding in spaces, I'm making little shapes, making it interesting, and seeing where we go. And that's pretty much that. I'm kind of happy with it. I'll submit it to someone, get rejected, have my heart broken again, and see where we go. And this really is the kind of final stage, I guess, which is working on a comparison and looking at the original on the left, just the original free writing. You can see it's whatever, it's just a couple of paragraphs, small paragraphs, and then finding onto the left, you can see the shape that I've developed. And even now looking at it, I don't love the shape, but it's completely different. So this is a little insight into my process. I hope that's been interesting. Thanks.